Emily Brooks hadn't planned on settling down in Redwood Glades. But after 2 tours overseas, a medical discharge, and one too many sleepless nights, the quiet suburban enclave nestled between the Oregon pines offered something her soul hadn't felt in years: calm. The modest gray house on Birch Hollow Drive was nothing fancy, but it came with something far more valuable: peace. And to Emily, peace had a name: Atlas. Atlas, her golden retriever service dog, was more than a companion. He was trained, vigilant, and loyal in ways most people weren't. He'd nudge her back from the edge more than once, steadying her breath during flashbacks, grounding her during panic attacks. In uniform, Emily had commanded elite K-9 units. In civilian life, she only needed one, and Atlas never failed her. But peace is a fragile thing in HOA territory. Redwood Glades came with its own flavor of order: manicured hedges, strictly enforced color palettes for front doors, and a homeowners association president who wielded her clipboard like a crown. Her name was Karen Schuyler, and if authority had a perfume, she wore it in gallons. The first time Emily met her was on move-in day. Karen walked up briskly, eyes scanning like a barcode reader, and stopped dead at the sight of Atlas sitting obediently on the porch. "I don't recall authorizing pets in this section of the development," Karen announced, not bothering with a hello. Emily kept her tone even. "He's a service dog, fully certified under the ADA. He's not a pet." Karen's eyes narrowed like a cat about to pounce. People find all kinds of loopholes these days. Emily had dealt with more threatening stares from men holding rifles. She wasn't about to be rattled by a woman with a laminated rulebook and name badge. "I follow the law," she replied. "Do you?" Karen didn't respond. She turned, scribbled something on her clipboard, and walked away, leaving behind a silence heavy with something unspoken. That silence lasted exactly 4 days. The first notice came on a Friday: "Your lawn height exceeds community standards by 3/4 of an inch." The second, the following Monday: "Mailbox color not approved. Please repaint in black onyx per guidelines." The third, on trash day: "Garbage can visible from the street post collection. Time recorded, 9:46 a.m. Each notice bore Karen Schuyler's looping, self-important signature, and each one came with a passive-aggressive smiley face, the kind that says, "You'll learn your place here, soldier." Emily complied with every request. She trimmed the grass, repainted the mailbox, and waited outside to drag the bin in like it was a military operation. She wasn't trying to start a war, but she could feel it coming. It arrived at the next HOA meeting. In a room that smelled like weak coffee and stronger opinions, Karen stood at the front like a general addressing her troops. "I propose an amendment to the community pet policy," she declared, tapping her clipboard. "All animals, including service animals, must be registered with the HOA and display official identification tags." Emily raised her hand, calm but firm. "That proposal violates the Americans with Disabilities Act. You can't impose additional requirements on service animals." Karen didn't flinch. "Federal laws don't override our community standards." Several neighbors shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke up. Emily felt the isolation like a draft in the room: cold, subtle, and unwelcome. After the meeting, Karen approached her alone. "If you want to be difficult," she whispered, close enough for Emily to smell the stale coffee on her breath, "I can be difficult too." The threat lingered in the air like fog. A few mornings later, Emily was on her porch with Atlas. The early sun filtered through the evergreens, and for a fleeting moment, things felt normal. She sipped coffee, read the local paper, and scratched Atlas behind the ears. He was calm, eyes half closed, his red service vest neatly fastened. Then a shadow crossed the lawn. Karen Schuyler stood at the edge of Emily's property, brandishing a spray bottle like a weapon. "Your dog is in violation of HOA Ordinance 7.3.2, she announced, loud enough for neighbors to peek through curtains. "No HOA identification tag." Emily didn't rise. She stayed seated, controlled. "Atlas is a federally protected service animal. That ordinance doesn't apply." Karen stepped forward, face flushed with anger. "I'm tired of you military types thinking you're above the rules." And then, before Emily could say a word, she sprayed Atlas in the face. The yelp cut through the still air like a gunshot. Atlas recoiled, pawing at his eyes. Emily dropped the paper, stood, and stepped between them. "What's in that bottle?" she demanded. "Vinegar and water," Karen said casually. "It won't hurt him. Maybe now he'll learn to respect authority." Emily didn't yell. She didn't curse. She simply picked up Atlas, walked inside, and began flushing his eyes with saline. The vinegar had irritated his corneas, but thankfully, no lasting damage. Still, Something inside Emily shifted, not fear, not even rage, but resolution. She called the police. 911. What's your emergency? I need to report an assault on my service dog. And it's a federal offense. When the officers arrived, Emily showed them Atlas's credentials, vet records, and security cam footage from her front porch. The spray bottle attack had been captured, full frame, full proof. One officer stayed to take her statement. The other knocked on Karen's door. From her living room, Emily watched through the blinds as Karen gestured wildly on her porch, trying to rewrite reality with hand motions. It didn't work. The officer looked unimpressed. Minutes later, both officers returned. She admitted to it, one said. She claimed she was enforcing HOA rules, but she was advised that interfering with a service animal is a federal crime. We're placing her under arrest. Karen was cuffed in front of her hydrangeas. She screamed about legal immunity, about her position, about how she'd have Emily evicted. But the only thing that left with her that day was her authority, stuffed in a squad car. As the vehicle pulled away, neighbors emerged like flowers after frost. One older man with a Vietnam vet hat nodded toward Emily. She's finally gone too far, he said. Another woman placed a gentle hand on Emily's arm. We should have spoken up sooner. Atlas, now calm, leaned against Emily's leg like nothing had happened. But something had. Something big. Something that would only grow from here. And for the first time since she moved in, Emily felt like she wasn't alone. The calm after Karen's arrest was not peace. It was tension in disguise. For the next 48 hours, Redwood Glades buzzed with the kind of suburban energy that comes only from scandal. Lawns were watered more frequently. Neighbors made awkward small talk at their mailboxes. Front porches became observation posts. Emily felt the shift, like wind changing direction before a storm. The same neighbors who'd whispered apologies or offered quiet nods of support were now walking their dogs past her house a little slower, lingering a little longer. The gossip was airborne. But Emily wasn't interested in gossip. She had something better, proof. Her security camera footage, combined with police documentation and a full veterinarian report, left no ambiguity in the case. Atlas had been assaulted. A federal crime had been committed. And the person responsible was no longer just a rule-happy HOA president. She was a criminal defendant. Still, Emily wasn't naive. Karen Schuyler may have been escorted away in handcuffs, but people like her didn't surrender control easily. Emily suspected the real battle wasn't over. And she was right. 3 days after the incident, an anonymous envelope arrived in her mailbox. No return address. Inside was a printed petition. Motion to remove resident at 112 Birch Hollow Drive for endangering community harmony, complete with a list of residents who had allegedly signed it. Some were names Emily recognized, others not. At the bottom, the bold scrawl of Karen's handwriting. This is not personal. It's about preserving order. Emily stared at the page for a long time. Not because she was surprised, but because it confirmed something she had felt deep down from the start. This wasn't about a dog. It never had been. It was about control. Karen saw her not as a neighbor, but as a threat to the ecosystem she'd carefully curated, one HOA violation at a time. But what Karen hadn't realized was that Emily knew a thing or two about ecosystems, especially toxic ones. She'd spent years defusing them in war zones, navigating chain-of-command abuse, and dealing with superiors who saw trauma as weakness. She didn't cower when challenged. She recalibrated. So she got to work. Emily scanned the petition and compared the signatures with known handwriting from other documents. HOA newsletters, neighborhood flyers. Several were clearly forged. She reached out to a few of the neighbors allegedly listed as supporters. 3 called her back within the day, horrified their names had been used without consent. You have my full support, one of them said. I didn't sign anything. Karen must have added my name. Emily compiled everything. The envelope, the scanned document, the audio statements from residents denying their involvement, and sent them to her lawyer. Not because she wanted to sue. Not yet. But because she needed to draw a legal line in the sand. And that line was crossed again at the emergency HOA meeting the following week. Emily hadn't planned on attending, but the invite was left taped to her door, signed by the vice president of the HOA, to discuss the recent incident involving board leadership and assess community next steps. It was vague, neutral, but underlined with urgency. She arrived early, Atlas by her side, vest on, head high. The community center was more crowded than usual, and the usual hum of conversation dropped to a whisper when she walked in. A few people nodded. Most looked away. The vice president, a soft-spoken man named Jeremy Hale, stood at the front with a nervous smile. Thank you for coming. Tonight's meeting will focus on leadership accountability, community liability, and recent events involving President Schuyler. Karen's name hung in the air like a thundercloud. Jeremy cleared his throat. As many of you know, President Schuyler was arrested on charges related to an incident involving a residence service animal. As vice president, I've called this meeting to initiate a motion of no confidence. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some surprised, some relieved. Jeremy continued. This community is bound by rules, yes. But we are also bound by decency, legality, and responsibility. No one, not even HOA leadership, is above the law. And as of this moment, I am recommending immediate removal of Karen Schuyler from her position on the board. He opened the floor to vote. Hands went up, slowly at first, then in waves. Emily didn't raise hers. She didn't need to. It was unanimous. Karen Schuyler was officially removed from the HOA board. Someone, no one ever said who, had replaced her nameplate on the front table with a blank one, as if she had been erased. The air in the room changed, lighter somehow. The tension thinned. After the meeting, several neighbors approached Emily. Some to apologize, others to thank her. You reminded us that we have a voice, one woman said. You did what we were too afraid to, said another. Emily didn't reply right away. She just looked down at Atlas, who sat patiently, ears perked, eyes bright. In that moment, he looked less like a dog and more like a monument to loyalty, to justice, to the quiet power of holding your ground. But the story wasn't over. Karen still had her court date, and the courtroom would become the place where everything, the pettiness, the pride, the prejudice, would finally collapse under the weight of the truth. Courtrooms have a way of stripping people bare. The varnished wood, the silent ceiling fans, the rows of indifferent benches, they make theater out of truth. And when Karen Schuyler stepped into the courtroom that Monday morning, she brought the drama. She wore a tailored navy suit that likely cost more than a month's mortgage in Redwood Glades. Her shoes clicked with each step like punctuation marks. And trailing her, attempting to maintain a confident stride, was her attorney, a man who looked like he'd rather be representing a hedge fund than the HOA president accused of assaulting a service animal. Emily sat in the front row with her attorney beside her, Atlas at her feet, calm and immovable as stone. He wore his vest. She wore resolve. The judge, a wiry woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for no-nonsense rulings, called the room to order. State of Oregon versus Karen Schuyler. The charges were read aloud. Interference with a service animal, animal cruelty, harassment, and reckless endangerment. Karen's lawyer entered a plea of not guilty, but it didn't hold weight for long. The prosecution opened with the footage from Emily's porch camera. The attack was clear. The bottle, the spray, the recoil, the whimper from Atlas. The courtroom, filled with HOA board members, curious neighbors, and even a few local reporters, watched the video in full silence. Not a cough. Not a whisper. When the clip ended, Karen's lawyer stood and attempted to pivot. My client believed she was enforcing community standards. She regrets the confrontation and did not intend harm. But the judge held up a hand. Your client's intent is not the issue. The law is. She turned to Emily. Would you please come forward? Emily rose. The courtroom didn't seem to shrink or stretch. It stayed exactly as it was. But inside her chest, the old heartbeat of command returned. Calm. Steady. Present. Miss Brooks, the judge began, please confirm your dog's status. She provided the documents, ADA certification, service training credentials, veterinarian records. The judge reviewed them carefully, then nodded. Thank you. Now tell the court, in your own words, what happened. Emily didn't dramatize. She didn't need to. She spoke like a soldier giving a field report. Objective, clear, measured. When she described Atlas's yelp, her voice dipped slightly, just enough for the judge to raise an eyebrow. When she described Karen's smirk, maybe now he'll learn to respect authority, the room visibly tensed. Karen's attorney objected, but the judge overruled it. When Emily finished, she returned to her seat. Atlas didn't move, didn't blink. He was a statue carved out of loyalty. Next, the veterinarian took the stand, confirming irritation consistent with acidic exposure to the eyes, and that Atlas was lucky to have avoided lasting damage. The final blow came when Jeremy Hale, the HOA vice president, testified. Calm, professional, and now clearly disillusioned, He presented the forged petition that Karen had tried to circulate, complete with handwriting comparisons and neighbor statements. It was more than harassment now. It was a coordinated attempt to push a disabled veteran out of her legal home. At that moment, even Karen's lawyer glanced sideways, as if seeing her for the first time. The prosecution rested. The defense declined to call witnesses. When it came time for sentencing, the room waited in bated breath. Karen, her posture slightly less stiff now, stood with her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She wore a new expression, not humility, not regret. Something closer to disbelief, as though she still didn't quite understand how her story had unraveled. The judge tapped her gavel once. "Miss Schuyler, this court finds you guilty of interfering with a federally protected service animal. Additionally, you are found guilty of harassment and reckless endangerment." Karen blinked rapidly. "You are sentenced to 30 days in county jail, a $5,000 fine, 200 hours of community service, to be completed at an animal rescue facility. And you will attend mandatory classes on disability rights and federal accessibility law." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen opened her mouth, but the judge raised a finger. "Don't. The most important law in this courtroom and in this country is that we protect those who need it. You failed to do so. You violated the very trust your community placed in you. And you did it not out of confusion, but out of arrogance." As the bailiff stepped forward, Karen's shoulders slumped. Emily and she locked eyes, just once. Whatever lingering entitlement had been etched into her face was gone now, replaced by a hollow sort of stunned silence. She mouthed something again. Maybe this isn't over. But this time, Emily didn't care. Because it was over. And it had ended exactly where it needed to, in the courtroom, not the street. As the courtroom emptied, reporters rushed to the front steps, microphones in hand. But Emily said nothing. She didn't need headlines. She had peace. Outside, a woman Emily barely knew from the neighborhood approached quietly. "We're starting a recall vote," she whispered. "Not just for Karen. For the whole HOA board. Would you consider running?" Emily shook her head. "No. I came here for quiet." Then she paused. Looked down at Atlas, who wagged his tail once, like punctuation. But maybe quiet's something worth protecting. Redwood Glades didn't change overnight, but something fundamental had cracked. In the weeks following Karen Schuyler's sentencing, the neighborhood seemed to breathe easier. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. Quiet greetings became warmer. The same residents who once averted their eyes now waved from across the street. A tension that had hung in the air like static began to lift. For the first time since she moved in, Emily Brooks could step onto her porch with Atlas at her side and not feel like an uninvited guest in her own home. But Emily had learned long ago that comfort is not complacency. 2 days after the sentencing, a small group of neighbors gathered outside the community center for what was being called an informal meeting of concerned residents. Emily wasn't planning to go until Jeremy Hale, now the acting president of the HOA, showed up at her doorstep. "I know you said no to joining the board," he said, holding a folder in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, "but I think you should at least see what's happening. People are finally ready to listen." So she went. Not for politics. Not for power, but for Atlas. For every other person who might one day move into this neighborhood and not know their rights. For those who didn't have the time or the training or the mental energy to push back. Inside the community center, about 30 people sat in folding chairs arranged in a circle. No podium, no microphones, just neighbors. At the center was a whiteboard that read, "What do we want our community to stand for?" Jeremy welcomed everyone and then stepped back. "This isn't about punishment. It's about redefining the culture we've allowed to grow here. For too long, one person's interpretation of the rules has become law. That ends now." There was a moment of silence. Then a woman raised her hand. "I was afraid of Karen. I won't lie. I didn't agree with what she did, but I thought staying quiet was safer." Others nodded. An older man spoke next. "I was fined for having a wind chime. She said it was a noise violation. I couldn't even appeal." A younger couple added, "We were threatened with legal action for painting our shutters navy instead of black." It all spilled out. The petty fines, the threats, the intimidation. The culture of silent compliance that had spread like mold under Karen's reign. Finally, Jeremy turned to Emily. "Would you like to say something?" She looked at Atlas, who sat calmly by her feet. Then she stood. "I didn't move here to fight. I moved here to recover," she began. "And I never expected to become anyone's symbol. But what happened wasn't just about me. Or about Atlas. It was about how power can be misused when no one questions it. She paused, letting the words settle. The law is not a weapon. It's a shield. And sometimes, when you see someone using it to harm instead of protect, you have to step in. Not for the fight, but to remind people what the shield was made for. There was a long silence, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy, alive. Then the woman with the wind chime stood. I'd like to propose a new rule. That all future HOA fines require a community review. No more single authority punishments. Someone else added, and any changes to rules must include a disability rights review before implementation. Another voice, let's rewrite the HOA charter to include a clause about ethical governance. The whiteboard quickly filled with ideas. The air was no longer tense, it was electric. By the end of the night, a motion was passed to hold a special election to replace the remaining members of the HOA board. Several residents nominated themselves. Some encouraged Emily again, but she politely declined. I'll support from the sidelines, she smiled. Atlas prefers his politics limited to belly rubs. Over the next few weeks, the transformation deepened. Karen's old HOA office was cleared out. Her meticulously filed violation records, most of which had no legal merit, were shredded. A new online system was created for residents to anonymously voice concerns. More importantly, community patrols were disbanded and replaced with rotating volunteer-led neighborhood walks, focused on support rather than surveillance. But not everything went smoothly. There were still a few who grumbled about too much change. One neighbor loudly complained that removing Karen was a mob mentality, and another threatened legal action when his front lawn flamingos were mocked in a newsletter. But Jeremy handled it all with grace. And Emily? She focused on healing. The attack on Atlas had reminded her that trauma could take many forms. It didn't always look like a battlefield. Sometimes, it wore a pastel polo shirt and clutched a bottle of vinegar. She resumed her morning walks with Atlas, each step lighter than the last. One morning, as she passed by the Schuyler house, now dark, shutters closed, a for sale sign wilting in the front yard, she paused. A soft noise caught her attention. It was a child's laughter, distant but rising. Around the corner, two kids were chasing each other on bikes. One of them waved at her as they passed. Hi, Atlas. Atlas perked up. His tail swished once. Emily smiled. Maybe peace wasn't the absence of conflict. Maybe it was the sound of children laughing without fear, of neighbors waving without agendas, of a dog's tail thumping the ground in joy. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth fighting for. 3 months passed. The leaves in redwood glades began their slow transformation, bleeding from green into blazing hues of amber and rust. The neighborhood settled into a rhythm, not perfect, but kinder. The new HOA board, elected by an overwhelming majority, introduced policies that prioritized support over enforcement. There were still rules, yes, but now they came with explanations, grace periods, and even friendly assistance from volunteers. People stopped seeing regulations as weapons. Instead, they saw them as scaffolding, something to build a better neighborhood on. Emily Brooks remained a quiet force behind it all. She didn't attend every meeting, but her presence was felt. When a new family moved in, a young couple with a toddler and an emotional support animal, she was the first to welcome them. She even hosted a backyard meet and greet, something she would have never imagined doing before. Atlas was a local legend now. Kids called out his name as he passed. Residents would offer him treats, approved, of course, and one elderly man claimed the dog had a soul steadier than any pastor. Someone even painted a small mural of Atlas on the back wall of the community garden, golden fur glowing in the sunrise, a symbol of the calm that had replaced the control. But peace, Emily knew, wasn't a destination. It was a choice, one made daily. She still had her moments. Nights when the dreams returned, or when the quiet of the woods behind her house sounded too much like silence overseas. But Atlas would be there, nudging her awake with that same calm look, as if to say, "You're home now. I've got you." Then came the letter. It arrived without warning, a standard legal envelope with no return address. Emily hesitated before opening it. She had a good idea who it might be from. Inside was a typed statement. Dear Ms. Brooks, I don't expect forgiveness. County jail is not a long sentence, but it's long enough to rethink everything. I've spent the past 63 days attending classes, cleaning kennels, and facing people who had far less power than I ever did. and yet carried themselves with more grace than I ever showed. I don't know who I became in that HOA seat. Maybe I always was that person. All I know is I was wrong. About Atlas. About you. About what it means to lead. I'm leaving Redwood Glades. It's not my community anymore. It never really was. You showed me that real authority doesn't come from a clipboard or a title. It comes from integrity. I didn't have it. You do. I'm sorry. Karen Schuyler. Emily read the letter twice. Then she folded it neatly and slid it into a drawer. She didn't tell anyone about it. Not because she wanted to protect Karen, but because she knew the apology wasn't meant for the community. It was for her. And that was enough. That evening, she took Atlas to the lake at the edge of the neighborhood. The air was crisp, the surface of the water mirror smooth. Atlas trotted ahead, occasionally glancing back to make sure she was still behind him. She watched him for a moment, standing at the edge of the lake, ears perked, tail wagging gently in the breeze. For the first time since arriving in Redwood Glades, Emily felt no tension in her shoulders. No hyper-awareness. Just stillness. She sat on the grass, legs stretched out in front of her. Atlas came over and rested his head on her knee. The sun dipped below the trees, casting gold across everything. "Good boy," she whispered, rubbing behind his ears. Atlas leaned into her hand. They sat that way for a long time, woman and dog, survivor and shield, citizen and guardian. And somewhere in that stillness, Emily understood the true meaning of victory. It wasn't in Karen's conviction. It wasn't in the votes or the meetings or even the policy changes. It was in the fact that when someone tried to take her peace away, again, she didn't just survive. She protected it. And in doing so, she gave others the courage to do the same.